Patty here, full-time reseller on eBay, Poshmark, and Mercari, better known as Girl Hustle on YouTube. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some tips on identifying vintage clothing. I'd like to thank you for taking some time out of your day to watch my video. I truly appreciate it. First thing I would like to say is vintage is 20 years. When you're making a listing, and if you're going to use vintage in your title, please make sure that you know the item is vintage and you're not misleading a customer. You don't need another seller coming back to you and telling you that the item isn't vintage. And more importantly, you don't want a buyer finding out later that what you sold them in fact wasn't vintage. So if you don't know, ask somebody who you may think does know. Believe me, I look stuff up all the time. Some things are hard to tell if they're vintage, if there's no tags. If there's no tags on something, what I'm usually doing is looking at what type of material is it, what era was this material used in a lot of, how is the sewing structure of the garment. I'll look for things like that, kind of get a guesstimate. But I try to find out as much as I can before listing it as vintage. So I'm going to be sharing with you some tips that have helped me over the years source vintage clothing. So if you're selling vintage clothing, please measure yourself and know that the sizes of vintage clothing is smaller than sizes of today's clothing. What I'm going to look for is a single stitch. This is one of the biggest and easiest ways to tell, excuse me, if it's a vintage shirt. You'll see how it's just one line of stitches, but then on the other side, it's double stitched in a nice thick row. So it's just a single stitch, but then it's doubled inside. That is the quickest and easiest way to tell if it's vintage. And I already know this is because but there is a lot of wear to this shirt. But another way that I know this is so much lighter and softer than this shirt. Please be careful for looking for these single stitch shirts. In the 90s, there were single stitch shirts made, but they were replicas. And a way to tell that is you'll see the single stitch on the outside, but on the inside, you'll see the double stitching. It won't be single stitch all the way around the shirt. So that's one way to tell. Another thing you want to look for is metal zippers. What you'll notice with the metal zippers is the metal is like a thicker metal. It's like a heavier kind of a metal compared to today's zippers. And yeah, it's like a thicker metal. Also, in vintage clothing, particularly women's pants and dresses and stuff, you'll see a lot of the snaps and the zippers and stuff will be on the side of the hip. It won't be like up the back or in the front. It's usually on the side. The pinked seams. The pinked seams they have that zigzag. If you turn the garment inside out, you'll see cloth that you'll see the sewing, but then you'll see the zigzag pattern of the end of the cloth. Number 3, if you see made in China, it's a newer garment. Look for tags that have 50/50. That's half cotton and half polyester. That's a vintage cloak. That's a vintage shirt. Tags that, if you've ever felt, they feel like paper. They have like a papery kind of a feel to them. A shirt that has a date on it, basically you could tell, like a lot of times you'll see these on concert shirts. Now this one is from a Super Chevy show in 2000. So we already know it's vintage because we're in 2020, it's 20 years. But definitely a vintage shirt. Pretty cool cars. Wish I had some of them. I wish I had one of them. That was a long time ago. This is a vintage one. This one's just like from the 80s. Not really that old, but 80s or 90s, and it's a Merona. This one, kind of, you go by the patterns, kind of look at the patterns of the shirt, which goes to, this is a Fashion Bug shirt. Again, this one, the store, the way it's made. See a label with the town and the town and the country, and there's no zip code after it. That's a vintage one. Also, that's like half sizes, like 16.5 or 18.5 or 9.5. That's a vintage shirt. I'm not going to get into the history of all of the reasons, because there is history and reasons behind all of this information I'm giving you, but it'll be a long video, and I just want to give you the basic tips to numbers. Now you have to read into this a little bit because it gets confusing. I found a lot of RN numbers on a lot of the garments, and it didn't pertain to what I read, some of this stuff, so I have to find another website to really look into that. If there's RN numbers, do a little bit of research on your own, and certain dates that there's so many, like for example, 6 numbers or more, it could be from the 80s, and less than that many numbers, it could be earlier, but I'm not exactly sure on that, so I don't want to tell you this as a fact because I know enough information. It's a little bit confusing with me. So if somebody knows, please leave me a comment down below. What to look for is an item with a lot number. So if you see a tag and then next to the tag you'll see, or you'll see somewhere else on the garment, you'll see lot 11. That's a vintage item. Okay, now this is a Wilson leather jacket, okay? Right down here, though, okay, you'll see the tag, and below it, it's hard to tell, but this tag that's faded, when I zoomed it in, it does have an L, like a lot number, because I'm familiar with what it looks like, but there's a lot number, so we know that this is a vintage jacket. And also the way it's made, a lot of women's clothing from the 80s had the shoulder pads in them. So a way that you can get used to if you really want to get into selling vintage clothing is, there's a wonderful website, and I've said it probably in 2 of my other videos, the Vintage Fashion Guild. They have copies of labels and different styles of the script through the years, and it can give you like a guesstimate on the age of the items, that some of the things that you're selling, idea of the age of clothing if you're really into selling it. But really, I'm just trying to give you the basics of what to look for. This is definitely vintage. This is a steeplechase jacket. union labels. If you see a union label, the garment is from the 1920s through the 80s. A little bit about vintage purses. Vintage purses are usually heavier. You can tell a purse if it's vintage. They're usually a heavier purse, and there's hardware. By hardware, I mean just stuff to keep it together, not the little stuff to keep it together, like you might have screws and, you know, there was a lot of construction put into it. There's a lot more with vintage clothing, but I just thought I'd give you a few tips on what to look for when you're out looking for vintage shirts, vintage dresses. One other one that I want to share with you, if you're selling vintage nightgowns or anything, the vintage nightgowns, you'll see the newer, you'll see the older ones, the tag will be on the side. With vintage nightgowns, you'll notice, now this is a beautiful Vanity Fair, but many times the tag is between the shoulders on the back right here. With this one, the tag is on the side. So these are some things that you want to look for. This is how you tell a garment's older. Now the ones that are on the back, they're the 80s and 90s, but before that they're like the 70s and earlier. So if you're sourcing vintage nightgowns or lingerie, that's one thing that you want to look for an older vintage garment, for an older vintage nightgown. From this video, I'd love for you to subscribe, and please leave me a comment. Share some of your tips with me. Take care.